Good evening. It's a pleasure to continue our talks we initiated yesterday. We have our next guest here with us, TJ Demas. And to just contextualize the series event for those who weren't there yesterday. This is a closing event of this 2-day series. We had today a productive and wonderful workshop, internal workshop, and all guests and potential authors are here with us. It is part of the research project and the series E-Cooperation, E-Cooperation. To just remind you, with this term we aim to explore both the ecologies and technologies of artistic, activist, curatorial and academic cooperation and their overlaps, hybridization and dissonances. Again, we posit that media formats and infrastructure play here a central role as they both enable and regulate processes of both sharing and exchange. Artists and activists, but also scientists and academic scholars seem to depend on the same media ecological environments into which they simultaneously intervene. So our points, or the points to a field of intention between the global and the local ecology, where dissonances, differences and ruptures become identifiable, signify as well both creative potential and political challenges. E-cooperation is part of an initiated cooperation between the University of Kassel, the Documenta Institute and the University of Zurich. And specifically, again, it's a pleasure to mention this here, the research project exhibiting film challenges of format, which is led by Fabienne Liptay, and also the other research project led by myself, Contested Amnesia and Dissonant Narratives in the Global South.
So it's my pleasure to introduce to you all TJ Demas. I don't know if I have to say much about him. I suppose that you read all his books. He's a powerful voice in the current debate on contemporary art, global politics and ecology. He's a professor in the Department of the History of Art and Visual Culture at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and also, importantly, the founder and director of its Center for Creative Ecologies. He has published widely especially on the conjunctions of art and politics, with a strong interest in the ability of artistic practice to intervene and invent innovative and experimental strategies to shape and form social and political reality. I would like to mention the most important. He's published so many things that I just would like to point out some. So I will refer to 3 recent books that he published. So there's Decolonizing Nature on contemporary art and the politics of ecology, which explores such creative proposals of systematic attention within art history to engage politically with environmental conditions. And there's that was published in 2016. In 2017, followed Against the Anthropocene on Visual Culture and Environment Today, which is a profound critique of the Anthropocene, also of the visual Anthropocene, as contributing to a neoliberal understanding of nature in terms of political economy. And his most recent publication is Beyond the World's End, Arts of Living at the Crossings, which emerged from a Mellon-funded research project that has emerged from the Center of, the Center for Creative Ecologies, posing a challenging and visionary question: what would happen, or what comes after the end of the world, setting the apocalypse as a possibility to envision emancipatory futures of an expanded political ecology. Today, his talk is very plainly and simply about cooperations and class war. So, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Liliana and Fabienne. Really appreciate the introduction and the invitation. Thanks everyone for coming. I have a presentation, should be about 40 minutes or so, and then I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Okay, in 2016 I published this essay, Gardening Against the Apocalypse, which was part of my book, Decolonizing Nature. It was an attempt to think critically about Documenta 13 in 2012, directed by Caroline Christophe Bukhardziev, and the way that exhibition positioned contemporary art's relation to ecology, focusing on practices of gardening, multi-species being, post-anthropocentric becoming, its sites of, as sites of mobilization against the ecocide of advanced capitalism, specifically the ongoing financialization of nature, land's transformation into property and patented through the biogenetic capitalism of big agriculture, the environment as a source of endless extraction and sink for polluting externalities, repeating centuries of colonial expropriation, and the related manifold crises of climate breakdown. My title, Gardening Against the Apocalypse, on the one hand signaled the seemingly outlandish ambition of eco-aesthetic practices to oppose the global economic and political power of corporate agriculture, its unjust neoliberal trade agreements, and the military force of wealthy states to defend their neocolonial world order, basically of corporate globalization, against any and all threats, including the challenges of labor militancy, environmental justice, and indigenous decolonization. On the other hand, I wanted to point toward the truly impressive range of practices of organic and permacultural farming occurring all over the world, from black urban farmers working in dilapidated contexts like Detroit in the States, to internally displaced indigenous farming, reanimating pre-Columbian practices of Chinampas in Mexico City, as well as I wanted to connect them to the social and labor and indeed artistic movements around the world defending the politics of life, which I mean communities' widespread demand for autonomous self-reproduction and the refusal of being displaced from the land, comprising anti-colonial efforts, the formation of solidarity economies, practices of social justice and environmental survival, whether in, for instance, Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi in the States, or Kenya's Greenbelt movement, led by Wangari Maathai, or Brazil's landless workers movement, or India's Adivasi movement in Odisha, and many more such examples. I wanted to argue that far from insignificant in relation to global corporate power, these are the grassroots movements that are urgently necessary to begin building alternatives to self-destructive, fossil-intensive corporate globalization. In that text, my operating assumption was that climate justice practices are necessarily anti-capitalist, posed against the orders of what we might call the racial capitalist-scene, a framing that views the dominant economy expanding over hundreds of years in tandem with colonialism and transatlantic slavery as the cause behind the geological transformation of Earth's natural systems. And as such, it's a more accurate descriptor, that is the racial capitalist scene, than the Anthropocene, which tends to generalize causality and attribute it to the human species, just as it universalizes impacts, as if we're all equally experiencing the negative effects. Bringing some criticality to Documenta 13, I tried to show how practices forwarding a climate justice framework were in friction at times with the liberalism of Documenta as both an institution and a curatorial project, a liberalism that typically refuses to take sides, instead opting to work within the flexible terms of neoliberalism that generally defines the political economy of dominant art institutions. But as I consider my essay now from today's perspective, I feel there was an inadequate discussion of climate politics in relation to class, particularly in relation to climate change as a form of class war, which I'd like to elaborate on today in providing some thoughts also on the current Documenta. So here we are now, 10 years later, in the context of Documenta 15. And what's our situation? The exhibition is the first curated by an artist collective, and Ruan Grupa has brought a collaborative approach to Documenta, discussed in the many interviews and statements that have been released in advance, in which they've stated their aim to create a sustainable arts economy through a collective of collectives. They draw on the Indonesian concepts of lumbung, referring to the grassroots and community-based strategy of sharing resources as a means of collective survival, and nongkrong, designating informal gatherings and hanging out as a mode of informal sociability. It's also worth mentioning that the collective was founded in 2000, 2 years after the end of the Suharto dictatorship, itself forged in the brutal anti-communist purge of the mid-1960s, a genocide in which approximately 1 million people were killed by death squads, which ended the anti-colonial socialist Sukarno regime, and which inaugurated the present post-traumatic regime of right-wing normalization and consumerist amnesia, explored in work like Taring Padi's, as well as films such as Joshua Oppenheimer's 2012, The Act of Killing. With Documenta, Ruan Grupa proposes extending lumbung to establish an international ecology of artistic practices, in part by sharing out the exhibition's substantial state and federal funding resources, which amount to an extraordinary 42 million euro budget. This against the backdrop of increasingly tenuous European and British cultural contexts where many member countries, as in the Netherlands and the UK, are considering or have already slashed funds for the arts and turning culture into an instrumentalized vehicle of reactionary ethno-nationalism, for instance in Poland and Hungary. More far-right extremist groups and parties in the UK, in the Netherlands, France, Germany, Norway, Poland, Finland, Austria, and more, appear to be gaining ground by joining anti-migrant xenophobia to a climate-denying petropolitics, what Andreas Malm and the Zedkin Collective term fossil fascism in this book, White Skin, Black Fuel. The term constitutes a resurgent anti-UN Eurosceptic climate denialism, merged with xenophobic ethno-nationalism, and more particularly an Islamophobia, all weaponized against the neoliberal market-based mechanisms of capitalist climate governance. So this is, of course, only worsened recently by Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, an eventuality predicted well in advance by US-backed NATO expansion eastward, well beyond its Cold War remit, leading to new cycles of international weapons sales benefiting corporate arms dealers, Germany's militarization and rearmament, raising Germany's military budget to 2% of its GDP, which is the highest level since the end of World War II, and prompting Sweden and Finland to join NATO. It's also prompted new sanctions geared toward punishing Russia's economy and cutting off Russian oil supply to European countries, including Germany, inspiring an intensified demand for European energy security through alternate sources of fossil fuels. So there's been a massive return to fossil fuel security, including expanded petrocapitalist infrastructure and new German LNG pipeline connections with Norway, the Netherlands, Britain, and Denmark. So faced with this new anarchic era of warring nation states, increasingly beholden to or tempted by ethno-nationalist extremism, a spreading rejectionism of the EU project, fossil fascism, and an anti-migrant violence, it's apt to join Hito Steyrl in asking whether Documenta's own decades-old project of internationalism turned globalism, a largely neoliberal artistic order that has often amounted to an abstract politics that never really engaged with Germany's own internal socio-political conflicts, or we could add Europe's internal rifts, is indeed exhausted. That is Documenta indeed exhausted? She asked in an earlier article. I'm not referring to her more recent positions and her withdrawal from Documenta. That's a whole other thing. In fact, Documenta's internationalism was always something of a myth. Its hoped for emancipatory diasporic public sphere, according to Okui and Wazer, amidst EU's open borders, was long contradicted by the Schengen zone's closure to the racialized, lower-classed, and ethnicized subjects of Africa and the Middle East, to the migrants that never achieved the status of the art world's nomadic elite. So too, the exhibition's sustainability politics must also be questioned, I think, for what options they offer and what liabilities they bring against this larger backdrop of fossil fascist geopolitics, rampant deglobalization, and the climate-denying recommitment to unregulated petrocapitalism it brings with it. Is it possible, in other words, to continue the commitment of gardening against this socio-environmental apocalypse, ultimately an apocalypse of capitalism itself, guided by the accumulation of wealth no matter what the cost, no matter who does not survive, with seemingly any disaster, even climate change itself, convertible into new financial opportunities for techno-scientific solutionism or fossil and green energy investments, all to maintain the status quo of ruling class economics. If so, what would it mean to understand such a gardening practice, or more broadly, an eco-aesthetic practice in class terms? I want to think of gardening as both an actual activity of growing plants in a garden and a metaphor for cultivating environmentalist forms of life in the expanded field of practice, for instance, as a kind of a set of eco-operations, where it can extend to a multitude of practices of, for instance, degrowth, sustainability, slow living, community-based collective and social practice, decommodifying and democratizing artwork through process-based, small-scale, localized activities, care work and mutual aid, and radical pedagogy, eco-art remediation and restoration, rewilding, connecting to indigenous notions of right relations, of buen vivir in indigenous Central and South America, the African philosophy of Ubuntu, and so on. There can be many overlaps between these engagements, and there's no need to divide or isolate their various strands. While these practices are often small scale and local, they can be framed within the terms of larger international projects of degrowth, the Green New Deal, the Red Deal, the Great Transition, the Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, system change, not climate change, half-earth socialism, climate Leninism, and indeed, Lumbung. So these are all important ways forward, each supportive of structural decarbonization and opposed to fossil fuel extractivism, to green capitalism, and the corporate globalization and militarism that support them. But the problem is not so much that these frameworks, but the problem is not so much with these frameworks as viable goals, as various versions of eco-socialism, but rather the lack of a viable theory of change to get us there, or what Coherent and Jody Dean termed the problem of transition for leftist political ecology. Owing to the disorganization of the left at all levels of society, right, after decades of attacks on, for instance, unions and labor militancy all over the world, after this disorganization, we lack the collective subject of historical transformation powerful enough to bring about the necessary global shift in modes of production to propel us from fossil capital to something like eco-socialism, dedicated to social emancipation and economic equality, meaningful decolonization, environmental sustainability, and multi-species flourishing. Not only are we faced with the lack of political power to stop the ongoing destruction of socio-environmental livability by global capital, we confront an impossible window of opportunity to act, a decade at most, according to many climate scientists, to stop the cascading tipping points, sending us into ever more extreme climate catastrophe. As much as gardening practices, again in their expanded definition of eco-operations or eco-aesthetics, as much as these are working toward this transition, they still face a number of challenges. First, there's the problem of what Nick Cernick and Alex Williams call folk politics. They write horizontalism, localism, nostalgia, and withdrawal, all embody to greater or lesser degrees folk political intuitions about how to do politics, and they all remain inadequate for the task of transforming capitalism. Or as Jody Dean says, Goldman Sachs doesn't care if you raise chickens. If we're not working, in other words, toward a majoritarian politics capable of transforming governing institutions, then there's little hope of intervening in fossil capital. This relates to a critique of Ruan Grupa's Documenta, that it fetishizes horizontalism and self-organization without acknowledging the unequal balance of power in the vast network of the global art world, how it intersects with the machinery of geopolitical power, and who, in the end, still holds the purse strings. That's a critique by J.J. Charlesworth. Second, and the flip side to the first, while cultural practitioners recognize the necessity of reinventing a politics of life based on ecological principles, a structural political analysis must also acknowledge, I think, that the greatest portion of the world's working class have been ripped from the land by decades of land grabs, agribusiness, extractivism, corporate consolidation, globalized supply chains, and neoliberal trade deals. More than decades, centuries, really. In this sense, gardening risks being limited to a middle class or privileged pursuit, especially if it leaves unaddressed the majority of the global urbanized proletariat, deprived of the ability to reproduce its livelihood except through exploitative wage labor and informal survival. Third, it's clear that mainstream and generally liberal climate politics, for instance, the politics of social movements like Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future or Greenpeace or 350.org and so on, that the climate politics of these groups are largely defined by professional managerial class interests. That is, of climate scientists, of journalists, of NGO members, of civil society activists, professors, students, which tend to view climate action as a matter of urgent degrowth, based on that class's own relation to excess consumption and the carbon guilt that comes with it. But the problem here is that degrowth fails to register with multitudes of the world's working poor who already struggle with austerity. As a result, a politics of less, or of degrowth, of consuming less, of living more simply, risks adding a kind of insult to injury to much of the world's population. If the goal is building a mass politics of climate justice, then what we need is a politics of more, not less. Specifically, more in relationship to more universal health care, more social security, more infrastructure, more free education, more quality jobs, without reproducing the unnecessary consumerism of the ruling class. As Matthew Huber argues in this book, Climate Change as Class War, we need a theory of change that's best pursued through political organizing at the point of production, including through working labor militancy at the site of fossil fuel extraction, refinement, processing, and marketing, as well as in related sectors of energy production, agriculture, transportation, and construction, not via a lifestyle politics of ethical consumerism, if we're to build the class composition necessary for global decarbonization. So I think this is really crucial. I'm really reducing the argument here, but the familiar bind that many environmental activists find themselves in is trying to struggle against this seemingly oppositional binary construction of jobs versus the environment. And I think that this is a real problem we need to overcome if we're going to have any kind of meaningful climate transformation. We have to think about environment through jobs, through specifically a working class majoritarian politics. So the problem is, as we all know, I think, we're moving in the opposite direction. After nearly 30 years of UN climate summits, which is the most significant site of global climate governance, there's little to show by way of binding resolutions, only more false solutions of market-based mechanisms, geoengineering promises, and blah, blah, blah. All the while, global emissions continue to steadily rise. So this has been 30, 40 years of the COPs, and still we see the steady rise of carbon emissions. And we can easily see the reason why if we look further into this. These climate summits are typically sponsored by fossil fuel corporations that have a vested interest, right? The class interest is key here in maintaining the status quo. So with geopolitical conflict, the kind we're seeing in Ukraine, we're witnessing a global regression toward guaranteeing fossil energy security by expanding its infrastructure and securing yet more reserves, reinvesting in gas as a transition fuel, and at the same time fossil capital, profiting massively in recent years, is winning at climate change as class war, falsely dividing environmentalists from worker interests, as if a viable climate must threaten job security. In fact, that idea totally contradicts the ecology of labor that I think we need to be talking about, as the collective practice directed toward the reproduction of life in common. And now a little bit on the situation in the U.S., where I'm based in California. In the U.S., we face this situation of a Democratic Party leadership that pays lip service to climate action but courts fossil capital, cynically using endless political defeats as fundraising opportunities, holding the electorate hostage against what is far worse, a fascist MAGA Republican Party dead set on white supremacy minority rule, carried out by an illegitimate Supreme Court in a jerry-rigged electoral system, selling its agenda through conspiracy theory, nostalgia, and racism, but which have failed to do anything to improve the material interests of the working poor and barely middle class, only doubling the wealth of billionaires during the pandemic. The result is a nation of endless crises, with unchecked militarized police brutality unleashed against black and brown people in spectacular acts of violence, within a country of more guns than people, legislated by a Supreme Court defending a racist constitution forged within a counter-revolutionary state of minority property rule dedicated to transatlantic slavery, patriarchy, and indigenous genocide. Electoral politics, beholden to corporate interests, have completely failed us. Universities, and particularly within the arts and humanities, are suffering more and more cuts. I don't know if you're following, for instance, what's happening at Goldsmiths in the UK right now. This is a dire situation. Unions have been decimated by decades of anti-labor laws, paradoxically amidst neoliberal deregulation, though there is some hope of reversing this trend recently with organizing efforts at places like Starbucks and Amazon. Political organizing is nowhere near where it should be. Often it's divided into single-issue concerns or liberal identity politics and the NGOcracies of the nonprofit industrial complex, happy to operate within the terms of the dominant economic regime. And the arts are increasingly enclosed within elite predatory institutions with new commodified asset classes as digitized NFTs amidst cryptocurrency trends representing nothing but ruling class investment interests and simply irrelevant to the many. Sorry, it's a little bit of a rant, but it's a dark situation, it truly is. Amidst this situation, the temptation of existential withdrawal, of political nihilism, of simple subjective surrender is overwhelming and incredibly difficult to overcome, especially on an individual basis. And I see this with students these days. But that, I think, is the result of experiencing the failure of the system as it's currently constructed. The only way out, as far as I can see, is to collectivize, to organize by building a working class base dedicated to politics as a system of organizing society according to a post-capitalist horizon. Of course, the working class is itself an unstable category, capable of all manner of reactionary formations, from ethno-nationalism to racialized definitions. But the ambition of the left must be to recompose class so as to connect working people's interests to a politics of life that overturns fossil capital and its apocalyptic populism. One example of this is what's happening recently in India over the last couple of years, the farmers' protest. A massive agricultural workers' rejection of the Conservative Party, the BJP in India, and its proposals for neoliberalizing agriculture, which brought out, at its height, 250 million people to stop this push by the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. And it's being covered in this case, in the Progressive International, which is an attempt to build a new kind of political infrastructure of the international left. I think this is really a very important project for the current moment that I'm looking at closely. Of course, there are many examples in Documenta. I'm not going to go over these in any depth, but Documenta and its collective of collectives, but none quite scale up or challenge the neoliberal enclosure of cultural experience within its institution. Really an institution of institutions that is itself heterogeneous, but generally subservient to in general to dominant economic arrangements. When challenges do arise, for instance, testing the limits of anti-colonial politics when it comes to Palestine and Israel, they're promptly shut down, as we've seen, showing how Documenta as an institution is in fact completely beholden to national political norms. Aside from this understandably complex issue of anti-Semitism, contextualized by, in some ways, a problematic German exceptionalism, the critical limits of Lumbung and any practice of ecological sustainability included in Documenta are revealed within the context of what we might call a kind of liberal repressive tolerance, which in fact perpetuates a long-standing logic of dominant culture, happy to entertain castles built in the air as long as they don't threaten ruling class interests. And we've seen lots of this. I've become very sensitive to this in my own work and writing and research. Finding examples of artistic practice that have the most radical decolonial emancipatory proposals exhibited in institutions that are neo-colonial, financially extractive, racist, and just that situation, the intolerability of that situation, I think, is becoming increasingly stark. So where do we find practices of organizing that actually do threaten ruling class interests, and what work? And that work by intensifying the contradictions between fossil capital and the eco-socialist politics of life. And I'll point to two examples, which I'll discuss briefly, and then conclude. So the first is this project Strike MoMA, an art activist campaign of institutional liberation, as it's called, directed against the Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, in New York. Begun in 2021. Possessing an anti-capitalist, anti-colonial horizon, Strike MoMA constitutes what they call a solidarity of struggles that unfolded initially in a campaign of 10 weeks, as you can see in some of the propaganda or agitprop that goes along with it, and organized by the coalition called the Working Group of the International Imagination of Anti-National, Anti-Imperialist Feelings, or the IIAAF. The campaign invited individual and group participants to join in a spectrum of activities, including art, poetry, and research, education, testimony, media, and action, as announced via Instagram, agitprop, and other forms of communication. And that group is itself a collective of collectives, bringing together lots of different organizations based in New York. That's, I think, really interesting as a formation, in other words, as an organizational structure, to have a collective that is building collectives, that's building solidarity between a diversity of collectives. And there's a couple dozen involved in this project. So they write, when we strike MoMA, we strike its blood-soaked modernity. The monument on 53rd Street, the museum, becomes our prism. We see our histories and struggles refracted through its crystalline structure, and foreclosed futures come into view. The museum is converted into a theater of operations, where our entwined monuments of decolonization, abolition, anti-capitalism, and anti-imperialism can find one another. Why strike MoMA? So that something else can emerge, something under the control of workers, communities, and artists, rather than billionaires. MoMA's board of directors, the board of trustees of the museum, are composed largely of corporate CEOs representing the fossil fuel complex, the dominant global economic order that runs on climate-destroying fossil fuels and extends outward toward virtually all facets of society, from conservative media empires and Trumpist propaganda engines to funders of US and Israeli settler colonialism, from supporters of repressive policing and the prison industrial complex to the profiteering arms industry. And these are just a sampling of a few people who are on the board of trustees. Its extractive, deadly interests are grounded in colonial conquest, requiring access to any and all lands, territorial, aquatic, atmospheric, and virtual. Its massive profits, accumulated through violent, racialized dispossession and generally obscene levels of economic and socio-political inequality, depend on the militarized security state in order to surveil multitudes, suppress dissent, and monopolize violence against counterinsurgency threats, including mass movements for social and economic justice. MoMA is toxic, according to the artists and activists, not because of this or that board member alone, but because its structural composition as a museum is continuous with the all-encompassing system of plutocratic inequality, racist violence, and lawless corporatism. In MoMA, we can perceive the cultural logic of fossil capitalism, which is bringing livable existence to the brink of ecosystem collapse. Strike MoMA represents the gathering of collective will to imagine an emancipatory future. Its insurrectionist vision, as you see in this one image on the right, is one in which museums and other arts institutions must pursue alternative structures, land back initiatives, right, returning land to indigenous communities, reparations, for instance, to African Americans after centuries of slavery, and additional ideas that constitute an abolitionist approach toward arts and arts patronage, so that they can align with the egalitarian principles that drew us to art in the first place, as explained in a public letter from the IIAAF. So the realization of a post-MoMA future will take nothing less than a solidarity of struggles. As one of the campaign propaganda's posters diagrams it, this solidarity would join together such struggles as the Red Deal. This is a proposal that supplements the Green New Deal made by the Red Nation, a really amazing revolutionary indigenous organization in New Mexico, and land back of indigenous sovereignty, and in anti-national internationalism, in alliance with collective liberation, black liberation, free Palestine, workers' control, and communization, guided by the objectives, as they put it, of kill capitalism, revolutionary care, and sanctuary now. While Strike MoMA is a project that organizes popular resistance against the 1% museum institution, engaging the terms of climate change as class war. And this project still continues, it's ongoing. They've had other successful campaigns against museums and their board of trustees in the States. The most well-known one is against the Whitney Museum, where they got this guy, Warren Kanders, removed from the board of trustees. He was an arms dealer and weapons profiteer who sold tear gas all around the world. But this one still continues. My second example is that of Rada de Souza and Jonas Stahl and their project, the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes, which uses the institution, in this case, Framer Framed in Utrecht, to stage a platform against fossil capitalism and its centers elsewhere, in the Netherlands, that is. Over the late 2021 and early 2022, the project enacted a more than human tribunal in which to hear testimony about the intergenerational climate crimes of fossil capitalist corporations and state institutions, specifically the weapons manufacturer Airbus, the energy and extraction financier ING, the polluting industry Unilever, and the Dutch state, which are all putting life at risk. As the organizers explain, they write, modern law institutionalize the separation of people and nature, turning the living world into property. Subsequently inscribing mass theft, murder, enslavement, resource extraction, and cultural genocide across living human and non-human worlds into the architecture of capitalist modernity. Racial ecocidal capitalism drives species extinction, perpetuating fatal intergenerational climate crimes as it destroys ecologies of interdependent life forms. And you can check out the project online. They have lots of recordings of the proceedings. Utilizing this legal framework, the CICC identified the fossil capitalist causality behind climate breakdown, transcending the limits of liberal institutions and also placing liberal legality on trial for its complicity in protecting property regimes. As a form of speculative juridico-political hearing, a kind of climate justice theater transpiring over 4 days last October, the court's citizen juries heard testimony about alleged climate crimes as expressed by international frontline community representatives. In this case, you're seeing Rada de Souza, one of the organizers, speaking. While actually existing law doesn't at present offer much recourse to hold perpetrators responsible for their world-destroying actions, the court's experimental forum offered a site where climate justice could at least be imagined, readied for a time to come when legal recourse may well be possible. Right? Already we have rights of nature proposals for legality. The problem is there's no systems of enforcement to hold states and corporations responsible when they violate rights of nature. So the whole problem of rights is that it tends to support liberal states first and foremost. And that's a real problem that Rada de Souza gets into with her book. I'll talk about in a second, What's Wrong with Rights. At the same time, the project offered a template of how the proposal to abolish intergenerational climate crimes and to establish intergenerational relationships of solidarity and comradeship among human and non-human species might actually be legally instituted, thus overcoming the liberal limitation. What this paradigm shift looks like is glimpsed in the CICC's visual iconography, which features, as you can see here, images of extinct animals, plants, and ammonite fossils appearing on yellow signs held aloft in the court, each labeled a comrade in different languages. In her book, What's Wrong with Rights, de Souza deconstructs neoliberal legal and state institutions, which she views as structurally compromised owing to their ultimate prioritizing of the rights of private property above all else, a problematic logic that turns social and material relationships, such as land and labor, into commodifiable things. How might such liberal rights, which generally offer the mere representation rather than the realization of justice, give way to an altogether different system, giving legal recourse to political demands for multi-species interdependency within shared ecosystems? That's the question that they're asking. How can we enact this legal shift? The only answer they arrive at is through social movement-driven political change, which, grounded in the power of the working class and extending to multi-species solidarity, remains uniquely capable of transforming states and institutions beyond the liberal horizon. That's an enormous claim, but I think that this is accurate. As the organizers write, the CICC aims to overcome the separation between humans and nature, emphasizing shared bonds through struggle to dismantle racial and ecocidal capitalism, along with its corporate and state agents, in order to ensure deep futures for all. Returning to Documenta, gardening against the apocalypse must still, I think, be the goal. where gardening is more than a folk politics of small-scale withdrawal, in constructing micro-utopias of living otherwise within a larger framework of global capitalist climate destruction. For the left's transformative energies to be effective, they must support organizing with the aim of building a majoritarian power capable of expropriating resources for the common good and restructuring governance according to democratic process. The current documenta already supports these principles. The task is to free them from being merely the subject of an art exhibition. Thank you. And now I think we're going to have a discussion.
Thank you, TJ Demos, for your talk and your reflection on the hyphen of the eco operations and discussed through the lens of class war. I think we have some questions. I have a question that I would like to start with. This is in the workshop we had before, just before your talk today. We mentioned that the hyphen could mean to stress frictions, dissonances, ruptures as a potential to contour those silences that impede to work together and to come together through networks of solidarity and care. And you mentioned in the discussion with the other participants that many times, or I think it was Dalida who mentioned this, there is a chance to follow dissonances and to listen to the silences those dissonances contour as a potential to overcome social antagonism. And when I followed your talk, I very much see the lines stressing the hyphen as social antagonism and agonal positioning of class, which is expressed in the idea of class war. But I would like to ask you where the other parts which are contoured as silenced as the right to obscurities, where are there in your idea of how can art imagine and be imagined?
Sure, it's a important, I think, discussion that's really ultimately complex and relies on different formations within left organizing strategy. Where to situate antagonism, and in recent decades, I think, at least in terms of my understanding of more cultural politics, like within artistic practices and developments, I've seen that there's increasingly a fragmentation and divisiveness on the left in relationship to whether it's identitarian concerns or relational antagonisms, attempting to render the community inoperative, to deconstruct the unity in community and this sort of thing, which I understand it's important to be able to articulate differences and not to have a kind of reductionist politics that suppresses difference and individualization or forms of individual becomings, say, including in relationship to an ecological more than human perspective. So I think that this is less of an opposition, and I think we talked about this after the seminar. At least I don't understand it as a hard opposition. It's more, it lays out the challenges of how to think about recomposition now. So I'm feeling and thinking really a lot about the present political urgencies of a threatened near future, of what Andreas Malm is terming fossil fascism. If that's the case, I think I think it is. If you look at the States, if you look at other countries, this is an international development these days. we desperately need to think about how to organize otherwise, how to institute otherwise, and build connectivity between different positions, not to suppress and eliminate difference, but to enact forms of solidarity and organizing across those differences. So that's what that's kind of like the large problematic that I'm trying to think through these days. So that ultimately wouldn't, suppress forms of non-legibility or differentiation or multi-temporality, non-synchronous times, a world of many worlds. But it would ask, like, what kind of cosmopolitical diplomacy can we enact that can somehow constellate those different positions to prevent the continuation of global fossil capitalist hegemony? I think this is a crucial strategic question. And it's one that I'm led to ask more because I'm increasingly involved in activism and organizing politically than what I'm seeing happening within art world or cultural discourse, within artistic practice and artistic discussions.
Maybe I can just add to this, or Fabienne, you will? Yeah. Just, you mentioned that, or you suggest that just looking also at the Documenta 15, that art should maybe transcend the exhibitional space to become more part of, to find solution to this question. So my answer, I do not have any answer, I have rather questions, would be, what kind of art do you imagine in that, and what is the role of art to reach across these differences, to formulate more sustainable and potential worlds, instead of emphasizing the hyphens, which of a class war, as you frame it, or as a hyphen who would fuel more these antagonism we are living every day in the world.
I think the majority, if not all, of the practices included in Documenta are doing that already, right? We see this multitude of practices brought together temporarily for the exhibition, but they're already operative and working, in the fabric of life in different, local community grassroots circumstances. So that's already the case, I think. Certainly the two examples that I pointed to, Strike MoMA, is not simply something that you would see in an art institutional context. It's something that is firmly rooted within living conditions of communities that are really fed up with the conditions of art institutions and the commodification of aesthetic experience, and demanding to take it back and to do something else with it. What that would be depends on where you look. I think Documenta offers a multiplicity of possibilities for how to think about art in the most expansive ways, where it's completely entangled within living conditions, and it's about what I was calling, with lots of other people who are proposing this, connected to a politics of life. What does it mean to think about reproducing our conditions of existence? This is fundamental to life itself. I think art is integral to that. Art is about, in that sense, building worlds together. And there's no limit on how or where or when that can happen.
Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe I would like to continue on this very complicated relations between arts and politics. And thank you very much for presenting a very strong position here tonight. So what I would be interested in speaking a little bit further, is the question. It's problematic that art institutions are able to invite their own critique. They are able to appropriate their own critique, and we could be self-critical of ourselves and say, Documenta Institute has invited us and you, to to strike Documenta, So this is something that that happens, so that a critique becomes exhibited itself, stabilizing the political agenda of the arts. On the other hand, you could say it is very important for artists to have art institutions and platforms to act politically. Maybe it would not be the same to do this without the institutions, such as all the the huge biennials that there are, and you quoted Hito Steyer, and I also remember one moment during the pandemic when she was online and she was showing a T-shirt that Harun Farocki actually produced as a limited edition for the art market. It's not so expensive, but more than a T-shirt you would buy in a shop. And on the front it says, it's horrible to belong to the art market as an artist, and on the back it says it's even worse to not belong to it. And then she presented her position, of holding a dialectic position between these two false alternatives, maybe, and to, as an artist, to use the exhibition venues to interact and intervene with them. And this is a stage also for an antagonistic politics that maybe is important. That would be my proposal, but maybe you would like to, pick up from there and say a little bit also about that relation between art and politics.
Sure. I think that we're all certainly working within contradictions, and we rely on institutions, like for me, university, or arts institutions that I work with, that are deeply structurally contradictory, including contradictory to my political analysis. And yet I think all too often we have positions like the one that you mentioned just now that's kind of clearly hedging its bets. And that playful dialectic or irony or whatever that is, I think we've had enough of that. And I think I want to think about ways to see clearly, yes, we need a transition. We can't just stop working with contradictory institutions. We have to organize within them, wherever we are, including, for instance, within the university system that is increasingly given over to neoliberal interests. It's become a factory of mass production of student indebtedness, especially in the States where many universities are private. Mine is public, but it's still operating that way on a financially extractive level. And we have to attempt to articulate the conditions of a post-capitalist horizon and attempt to do everything that we can to reach that, to organize, to work toward empowering a collective resistance to the conditions of ultimately racial and colonial capitalism. Otherwise, the violence will continue. We're seeing it in all sorts of ways, all the time, everywhere. There's too many examples to cite. When we add on to this ecological conditions, there's no time to waste. So I don't want to condemn conditions of necessary complexity, especially when they come to the need for survival within contradictory institutions. But we have to, I want to try to have a clear political analysis and a kind of objective to work toward on a collective basis. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Maybe I can just propose another question relating to what Fabienne just formulated. I think we could believe that institutions are something that can learn, or they learn themselves through a critical framing and self-critical, let's say, discussion. And I think we see, and this might be a hypothesis now here, we see with Documenta 15 that even the big institution of Documenta has learned to a certain degree, inviting Rangrupa and bringing together artistic and aesthetic practice that are interwoven with many ecosystems and forms of life, given a platform from those that are normally excluded, from those who are involved in strategy of survival, giving them here the platform of formulating their position and voicing their position. And I think in that sense, that is I at least can recognize a learning process through the institution. So if I understand you right, I see that we are at the border of a climate crisis, that we cannot just continue on imagining and talking about apocalypse. It's time now somehow to act, intervene. But does this mean to dismantle the institution and start from scratch, and how would that be? Or does this mean to push the learning capacity of the democratic institution we have, such as museum spaces, schools, university? So I just would like to understand this better, how you propose to think this transition and how we can shape this transition to a more just world and a more eco-sustainable world.
Well, there I was proposing that we think more about transition. And certainly I would not position myself as having the answers here, but I'm thinking along with people who are, systematically trying to consider what transition needs to be. And we're familiar with a kind of liberal reformism where some institutions may learn in some ways, to the extent that it doesn't ultimately threaten, I would say, their economic or their material interests as an institution. And then there is no more learning that can happen. And I think we're seeing that there's a difference between Ruangrupa and Strike MoMA. Like, Strike MoMA is not invited into MoMA at all. I mean, MoMA calls the police on Strike MoMA. It tries to mobilize the state's security apparatuses to shut them down. So it's not at all about the institution learning, even though Strike MoMA has made, ovations to have such discussions. But I think there's, yes, we have to do what we can, work within institutions, try to restructure them, reform them, make them more accountable, democratize them, as well as institute otherwise and create different formations that can support that kind of majoritarian, justice-based politics of equality and ecological flourishing. I think, if you read people like political analysts and theorists, like Jody Dean, for instance, that I cited Jody Dean and coherent. They're talking about looking at transition in relationship to class terms. That what you have, you don't have like the owner of a business learning how to be more or less, more friendly to the workers. There's a fundamental structural antagonism between exploiting labor and working for a business that ultimately is about a negotiation of power when it comes to tactics like strike and withholding labor. And I'm less convinced that if we understand institutional transformation in those terms in relationship to labor struggles, and there are many labor forces of museums that are unionizing, or within the university, or within other spheres related to art world activities. It's not like management and owners are not so open to learning. really. It becomes a form of, like, in many ways, brutal class antagonism. And I think, like, that's the kind of analysis that we have to consider more in relationship to how we engage with institutions. Certainly, I mean, I haven't gotten my university to learn from my suggestions or the faculty's suggestions. I mean, it really will require, I think, collective labor and its withholding to force management, to force the administration to transform. I think that's the kind of situation we're looking at.
Thank you. I think it's time now, Fabienne, to open the discussion to you, to the public. You're very welcome to participate in it. So there's the first question.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm not sure I feel any hope yet, but perhaps through this discussion there'll be some paths kind of clearing. So worker organization, you mentioned as a platform for solidarity building through the association of similar conditions of limited well-being and the structural problems inherent in that. So we're seeing much more unionization and union activity, certainly in the UK setting, and it's linked to the crisis of the cost of living. And those things are really positive. At the same time, it seems that there is work to be done for that to be connected to climate justice. And how do we get from, I guess, the question of exclusion from the aspirational culture of having more to that then becoming a struggle about collective welfare and being better, all of us, no? Because it hasn't, it seems to me, quite reached that point where these things are being connected, and how do we perhaps get to that point? And I would just like to add something to this in respect to education. So educational fora are really important spaces. They're more, I guess, kind of diverse spaces where work can be done, I guess, to instill learning about solidarity, collective work. We've certainly seen the difficulties in implementation of education for sustainability in certainly the UK education system. Our neoliberal universities as well have these issues of indebted students. So I guess where to become most efficient in operationalizing that work of kind of educating ourselves and our students about collective organization, that's I guess a different question than the first one about union activity and making that association beyond, exclusion from being more well off to collective well-being in general.
Thanks for that question. Part of my thinking is really grounded in collective self-education. So, like organizations that I'm involved with are asking these questions, posing those challenges, and trying to do that work. So it's again, like I'm thinking along with other people and trying to figure this out together. I think that's what we need to do. So when it comes to making or connecting the dots between, say, labor and environmental politics, I think this book by Matthew Huber was very important for me recently. It just came out recently from Verso. But the critique of the class politics of climate activism, I think, is really significant and important. And certainly, like, I found myself falling into that for a long time and thinking along those lines, meaning trying to, confront the fact that, like, why isn't, or asking the question, why aren't we enacting these policies? Why aren't people supporting this? Isn't the science clear, right? In other words, relying on that kind of climate politics of ideas and education and information, rather than connecting it to people's lives on the ground, who may feel and easily understandably, may feel threatened by the politics of climate activism, especially if it's geared toward demanding degrowth as the solution. So I think for me, this can happen through, for instance, if you take proposals like the Green New Deal and connect it to labor, ecologies of labor, basically. What that means is literally, like, as we're trying to do within our organization, setting up meetings and talking to people within, for instance, the building trades, or working within energy systems in California, and trying to discover what is important to them. It's less about like us speaking as people who know everything about climate solutions and informing workers of, you know, what they should do or how they should behave, and rather creating the conditions of like an accountable relationality with them, so that we can build the trust and have the conversations to get to the point where we can organize together. And that would transform the Green New Deal toward more of what we could call a workers' Green New Deal, so that it's not about potentially threatening workers who are working in fossil energy systems with redundancies, or a leave it in the ground politics that will leave them economically insecure, but trying to start out from the basis of where they are and demanding an energy transition so that we can support forms of reskilling and retraining, restructuring of labor itself, so that no one is left out and we don't have this kind of class antagonism between climate activists and labor organizations. So that's the kind of struggle that we're working with, to try to educate ourselves, to try to have those conversations and build relationships through accountability and trust, and in support of a politics of life in common. But that's no easy thing, by the way. I mean, it's not always fun. It's very difficult. It's awkward. It can be really challenging. But we're at such a point of, like what I was trying to suggest, of disorganization on the left. These are the conversations that we need to be having.
Yeah, maybe this goes into the same direction. You mentioned this term instituting otherwise, and I would be curious how you would think about this term in relation to our contemporary understanding of liberal representative democracy. And because you mentioned that you at some point define it as instituting otherwise as politics of equality and ecological flourishing. And I would be interested in what you mean precisely with equality. Because I think there's also a discourse around, you know, the possibility of equality, and yeah, would be interested in your thoughts around this. If there's also an ideology constructed around this idea of equality, and my second question would be around this discourse that emerged with Documenta 15. Which is an old discourse, whether this is still art. And I was wondering how you would evaluate this discourse in the context of your argument of the class war, because yeah, it was just a spontaneous thought that this is, you know, a very conservative argument to make, that leaves out this kind of necessity of what you said, art being integral to nourishing the foundations of life. Yeah.
Thank you. Those are also big questions. And, you know, again, I can only answer provisionally, because these are really difficult, complex, challenging issues that you're raising. I think the question, you know, is this art is less interesting than what kind of world is it building? What is it contributing to as an aesthetic practice? What is it imaging? What is it doing? What is it performing? Those are the kind of questions that I would be interested in asking. Less about is it art, because that presupposes, well, we know what art is, and we have gatekeepers who make decisions about judging and all that stuff, which I'd like to get away from that. So I'm more interested in looking at, well, how does it function? Who participates in it? How does it work in its local situation? Those would be the kind of questions that I would ask, and then ultimately, I'm really interested in stuff. How is it improving our struggle against fascism? Like, and that's such a. There's no single path on how that might be done, but I think those are the kind of questions that we should be asking of practices these days. Partly because we're in this condition of urgency. As much as some of us want to avoid falling into a politics of emergency. In terms of the first question about representative democracy, I mean, clearly we're facing the total corruption of democratic institutions these days, especially in the States, with the amount of just money and corporate funding and lobbying and corruption, basically buying politicians. This is rampant. Is this a problem? Is there something structural here about representational democracy? Maybe, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in that area of political theory. But I think other systems like Zapatismo, for instance, or Oaxacan assemblism are really interesting insofar as it's not about electing representative officials or lifelong politicians or experts, but everyone is expected to serve. Right? When you're called on, you serve and you represent your community and you're beholden to your community. You have accountability. The idea is you can't be bought or funded. You don't need to run an expensive campaign to get into office. Right? Political representation is equitably distributed, including in relationship to gender. I think this is amazing. This is really something that we should have. I think what's happening in Chile now, in terms of rewriting the Constitution, this is something that the U.S. should do. We need to rewrite the Constitution because, like in terms of what I indicated in my presentation, because this has come up in relationship to the Supreme Court recently, the fact that these justices are what's called originalists, trying to interpret the law on the basis of what they think was intended in the 18th century when the Constitution was written, is a recipe for disaster, and that's what we're seeing. Just a complete, like, Christian fundamentalist literalism. So I think we need to rewrite the Constitution. But I'm getting way off target. Yeah, why don't we leave it there?
I would like to use the privilege of holding the mic. Sorry. I have a question actually on something that you touched upon very briefly, because so you've been talking a lot about the imagination that is happening within art, and then also maybe a sense of futility that emerges from contemporary world politics trying, or not even really trying, climate change. But what I wanted also to ask you is on the term Anthropocene that you only touched upon, being a term that originally comes from geology, natural sciences that largely are non-political or apolitical and, well, generally do not sense a feeling of having this kind of discussion. So now we are rather in the humanities or in a tradition of understanding ourselves as a political or as taking a political position in whatever we do. So yeah, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are, what natural sciences' role is in this kind of situation that we are facing right now.
In relationship to the Anthropocene or climate change?
I mean, the Anthropocene being a term that was originally only thought for a very small natural scientist circle, not necessarily thought to talk about politics and ideologies. And yeah, then the responses that come from our side as proposing the Capitalocene or Plantationocene. Is there a problem within natural sciences or coming from natural sciences, or is there a problematic point in natural sciences in feeding into the situation that we have right now in general?
I think there is, and it's capitalism that basically funds sciences that are increasingly instrumentalized according to agendas of patrons and donors. I think that's the central problem. And so with the Anthropocene too, even though there's lots of really interesting, important academic research and theorization about the Anthropocene, some by people I really look up to, some of my colleagues, for instance. At the same time, like it's just the amount of resources and funding available to those people is nothing compared to the neoliberal Anthropocene and the kind of funding that's going to the natural sciences and engineering in order to develop a kind of like technological ways of approaching climate breakdown, specifically with geoengineering that's happening internationally. This is a kind of instrumentalization of the natural sciences in order to serve the agenda of a kind of fossil capitalist agenda to try to create ways of mitigating disastrous global warming so that the conditions as they exist can continue indefinitely without being threatened. I think that's very clear if you look just internationally at the funding of geoengineering, where it's coming from, like for instance Silicon Valley, fossil capitalist organization, like fossil fuel corporations, and even conservative politicians, because they are all part of the same kind of ruling class interests that support this as an approach. So I think the most important thing is for science to invoke some sense of ethical distance from those institutional structures. At UCSC, we have one small example of this. It's called the Science and Justice Program. It's a really interesting approach to science that tries to merge it with justice, to ask those kinds of questions, including engaging in forms of institutional critique when it comes to toxic funding. And I think we need more of that. I suspect the situation is different in Europe because there's not the same exposure to private sources of funding. But nonetheless, I suspect something similar is also going on here.
I know you have some experience in Mexico and Latin America, and I'm an artist from Mexico. And what I see, I don't know if you see it as an opportunity or the contrary. The institutions are not well funded, like MoMA or Documenta, and it seems like we're mimicking still these sort of structures that do not encourage or enable a communication with class, with labor, and but still it feels like it could be an opportunity because the institutions are not. At least the institutions that are part of the government, they don't have any money, no. So I wonder if this is something that you see as an opportunity, or because also in Mexico there is a huge class. There's a lot of inequality, so there's a difference, and so. I'm tempted to see it as an opportunity, but I don't know what's your opinion.
Yeah, I think I agree that there's an opportunity there. I think that there will always be an asymmetry between, say, like the billionaire class that has command of tremendous resources and the majority of the rest of us. And there will never be inequality or even anything approaching to it in relationship to institutional power. And so I think that we have to ultimately rely on and do what we can from a position of, in some ways, structural weakness. So that has to be opportunized. It has to be turned into a place of organizing and building power. And I think what we do have is and many people point to this, but is people power or the numbers. And I think that's where it becomes crucial to develop strategies of collective action and collectivization and organization so that we can get into a position where we can actually challenge dominant conditions. So the types of practices and institutions, even, and organizations that I've seen in my limited experience in Mexico, for sure I see that. There's lots of extraordinary practices and efforts toward institution building that I think are really interesting and important. I mean, I included some passages on Zapatismo, for instance. That's one example. I mean, after a few decades, they continue to expand. I think it's really inspirational what's happening there. For instance, that's just one example, but there's many others more in the urban context in Mexico that are really super interesting.
Thank you for the talk. I couldn't help but think when you brought up the example of Documenta 13, that I don't want to sound hopeless, but I was thinking about how back then, at least in my experience, we were more hopeful. And so I just wanted to bring up this changing context also of exhibition making and hope in our world, because I was thinking, what is the significance of Documenta happening now in the context of Germany inflating its weapons budget, and in the context of seeing migrants killed on the border in Melilla, all at the same time as this Documenta is on. And not only Documenta, but I would say also, for instance, the Venice Biennale, at the same time as the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So we're living in a time when we see really like art discourse going in one direction and the world really going in another. And in your presentation, I also noticed that the initiatives that I think have created real change are actually the unions, rather than the art initiatives. So I wonder if you have any examples of art initiatives that have produced real change, and if not, is it a problem also of how we value art? Because I think that what if we started, maybe this is a bit of a provocation, but what if we started to value the success of an artistic or a curatorial project based on whether it has made real change?
Well, I think the organizers that are part of the Strike MoMA initiative, Decolonize This Place, have had some successes. And I mentioned one, like getting Warren Kanders removed from the Board of Trustees from the Whitney Museum. That was a major success, even though it was not like the ultimate success. It was just getting one person removed from the Board of Trustees, whereas they want to liberate institutions completely. So I agree with you. I think we need to celebrate the successes as much as possible. Unfortunately, it is really hard to do that when there's not so many clear successes, and in fact there's mounting defeats. So yeah, as a matter of strategy of infusing a kind of hope as a form of collective practice that's grounded in material engagements, not as an escapist fantasy of constructing utopias in a far-flung world, but actually hope that can be a compass of change. I think it's crucial to point to successes, even if they're incremental, even if they're very small scale, so that we can attempt to gradually build those and assemble them into the kind of larger scale structural transformations that we really need. Just the one thing that I struggle with, though, is to see the hopefulness of exhibitions 10 years in retrospect balanced against the degradation of political conditions 10 years later. And that's kind of what I'm seeing these days. So despite the hopefulness of lots of the practices included in this Documenta, it's truly scary to think about what life might be like in another 10 years.
I want to come back to the labor movement and solidarity issues, because I started as a young artist with researching the border of Mexico and a lot of deregulated workforce there, in a situation very weak to negotiate as union and get unionized, because they were fired immediately. And they began to reach out to those labor unions in the north who had lost their job. So it was a kind of a cross-border organization and solidarity. And that happened 30 years ago, and I don't see that many labor movements going on right now at all. I think they're not the most successful social movements at this moment in time. Maybe Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and other movements are have a lot more visibility. But I see that you mentioned the farmers' movement in India, and I'm just wondering. I'm not so informed about this now. I'm just asking: is there solidarity on this international level in these movements that you observe and recognize, or what is the situation now?
It's not as strong as it should be, but I think it's growing. There's a growing sense of the need and desire for international forms of solidarity, and for movements to connect between national divisions. So I think it's this may be my own naive hopefulness, but I think it's beginning to grow. Lots of organizations, including one that I belong to, DSA, it has expressed lots of forms of international solidarity. And I think the labor movement arguably is turning around these days. And we're seeing the very low point of disorganization in the last decade or so. And now there's really a lot of excitement around labor union wins in the States, which is really incredibly inspiring. And this includes a lot of people working in precarious labor situations, like part-time labor, Starbucks, this kind of thing. That has, they've suffered decades of assaults and forms of union busting activities. And we're starting to see some wins. And I don't know, there's the most labor organizing recently that has happened also successfully, as well as in terms of organizing strikes, in decades, actually. So it may be too early to say, but hopefully this is the beginning of a turnaround. I don't know what that's going to look like. It's still hard to imagine. But the problem with the social movements that we're seeing is there's kind of a lack of durational institutional security within them. And that's something that, of course, labor militancy has to offer in terms of organizing strategies. So all too often we're seeing these social movements take to the streets after some kind of particularly horrific act of violence or racism or whatever, and then they dissipate, and then it's over with. So again, we return to the question, how can we think about durational organizational strategy? And I think that the place to look historically to learn those lessons, as well as the lessons of what defeat looks like, is labor organizing. So I don't know, we'll see if that happens, but it's hard to imagine that there will be meaningful structural change without it. In the meantime, we're seeing just the continued expansion of economic inequality to levels that people are now calling neo-feudal. And that's really disturbing. How long can that go on for?
Amazing talk, TJ. It's Andrew Urosky. Nice seeing you again after a little while. I loved hearing about the Red New Deal. I remember when we were arguing that the Green New Deal didn't go far enough, and of course now we don't even have that. I noticed a kind of, I felt myself a kind of melancholy to this document, especially as the other speaker observed to the one that you mentioned 2 times ago. And I wanted to think about that in terms of your critique early on of horizontalism, localism, self-organization as these kind of folk political institutions, folk political intuitions about how to do politics that were inadequate to the collective subject required for structural change now. This is going to be one of those big questions that's probably unanswerable, so if you're uninterested, just throw it away. And you talk about class, which I think is, of course, crucial. But after Mao, after post-colonialism, there's also, of course, the issue of North versus South, which I think bears very much on this document in particular. So I think the larger question I wanted to just push you a little bit on is, what is the subject of history here, to be a little bit Hegelian? And perhaps related to that, who is the imagined audience for Documenta? So is the subject of history the global South? You know, because when you started, it seemed like it was. It seemed like you were saying India is rising up. The global South certainly has the manpower. They outnumber the global North, 5-1? It seems to me inconceivable that the global South, even with that manpower, could possibly overwhelm the global Northwest, given the power and financial situation that colonialism has resulted in, and the imbalances of power that creates, we could argue. But I'm also curious about the audience of Documenta. Documenta is, of course, supposed to be a kind of global show of contemporary art. And here, you know, there was a critique of Israeli artists not being represented adequately, which struck me as kind of ridiculously beside the point, because there were hardly any artists from the North. You know, this was an exhibition of the global South to me, and one that was long overdue. But is it an exhibition for the global South? And so then I guess, you know, I'm trying to kind of get around this question of the problem of transition that you mentioned, that Jody Dean talks about, and sort of what kinds of, you know, what kinds of relationships we're trying to foster. Is it about trying to sort of help parties within the global North to overthrow their own systems through models imported from the global South? Is it the North providing resources or some kind of other, you know, models to the global South to do, you know, just how does that work kind of in practice? And then a second and just kind of related side issue was I fear that there's not enough attention perhaps amongst the US left as to why economic identity is not a stronger social and cultural bond, especially among the youth of today. And that why people of my generation and older tend to disregard these as kind of identitarian issues, whereas my students tend to think of these as thoroughly political issues in a way that's harder for kind of me and my generation. And then finally, kind of what the left could learn perhaps from the psychology and psychodynamics of the right. Why do the center right and the far right keep winning the hearts and minds of so many people when they're completely contrary to their, you know, what we would see as their political self-interest? So if you have any thoughts on any of those, I'd love to hear it. And if you want to just toss it, that's fine too.
Yeah, thanks for those observations and questions. I heard a few things I could try to respond to, even though I agree it's really, those are all really super complex issues that I can't possibly answer right now. But in terms of, say, there's three things maybe that I'll try to address. One is, you asked who's the subject of history. I'm thinking a lot about that these days, trying to finish up a book on what I'm calling radical futurisms, drawing from all these practices and collectives like black quantum futurism, indigenous futurisms, queer futurisms, non-binary futurisms, anti-capitalist or multi-species eco-socialist futurisms. And the question is like how can we avoid the familiar retreat into different essentialist identity categories? How can these potentially, even though they don't share the same interests, at least not identically, how can we nonetheless develop a shared project of solidarity between these positions, which I think is crucial. That's the biggest question for me right now. In other words, how to get beyond identity politics, as it's been a really debilitating, negative, divisive logic, I think ultimately of liberalism, serving ruling class interests in the end. One book there that I found really helpful is Assad Haider's book, Mistaken Identity, which is really fantastic in breaking down the debilitating conditions of identitarianism these days. Mistaken identity. So the position I'm coming to is really what I found, like there's lots of different articulations of this, but reading the theorizations that are coming out of these different groups and their attachments to radical black tradition, to indigenous decolonization, to critiques of the gender binary, of heteropatriarchy, heteronormativity, eco-socialism, is a kind of subject formation of what we could call maybe along the lines of Walter Benjamin, the tradition of the oppressed. I think that's where we find the subject of history. But it has to be composed. It's not something that's just ready-made sitting there, which is why organizing becomes so important. So how can we then develop strategies, including within the cultural sphere, as a mode of artistic creativity, of connecting the dots between these different formations? How can we have how can we invest in modes of solidarity as a form of political relationality? After decades of, especially within artistic discourse, of solidarity just being endlessly bashed, I think, ultimately, because people, various writers are acknowledging, even to the point of creating a kind of sense of capitalist realism, as if there's no way to forge solidarity these days. So I think that's a real barrier and something that is a major challenge that we have to figure out ways to overcome. So how to compose the subject of history on the basis of the traditions of the oppressed. That's what I'm looking at in my book, and trying to propose ways of thinking about learning from practices that are trying to do just that. And for instance, Jonas Stahl is one example. Jana van Heswick is another one. Another aspect, another point that you raised was about what can we learn from reactionary discourse in the way that the right has won historically. I think we indeed have to study what they've done and how they've done it. And this has come up, just one small example of this is the overturning of Roe. I think there's some research out there that we can find where people are studying like exactly how did this happen. It didn't happen overnight, it happened after 50 more years of organizing. And that's something that we can, on the left, we need to take seriously and learn from, actually. Like what does it mean for us to do that? What would be a multi-generational horizon for us to have that we ceaselessly aim for and organize around, and achieve ultimately? That's, I think, absolutely crucial, and we have to indeed think about that. Was there something else? Oh yeah, Documenta and I think the audience of Documenta is it's multiple, but definitely Kassel, Hessian, German, European, largely privileged global art tourists, or people who are appreciating the arts, not necessarily coming from more regional and local bases, but internationally, certainly. It's not an exhibition. If it's an exhibition of the Global South, it's not for the Global South, I think. I would wager. But that's not to say that they can't take the money and distribute it in the way that they are strategically, and in really important ways, in order to amplify and empower practices that are taking place in the Global South. So I think that is a really interesting development, and let's see what happens. It seems like Documenta as an institution is already paying the price for this, and it may not happen again. I don't know. We'll see. But I think also, just lastly, global south and north, I would want to resist any kind of simple binary between those two, right? I think ultimately the subject of history is not the global south per se. It's traditions of the oppressed that are occurring within all areas of the world, and increasingly are sucking more and more of us into those conditions. What some people call a kind of generalized proletarianization. Certainly we're seeing that in the university. More and more people are becoming precarious in all sorts of ways. So it's not the traditions of the oppressed, importantly, I don't think cannot be assigned to this or that identity. It's more of a class position in relationship to the ruling class, ultimately. And we all need to enter into solidarity with that.
So maybe those are the closing words. I thank you very much, TJ Demis, to share with us these thoughts and the discussion. And so we will just end this session and hopefully continue on another occasion on these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the questions. Thank you, everyone.